Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this special Northshire Presents. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Rachel Person. I'm the event manager for Northshire Bookstore with locations in Saratoga Springs, New York, and Manchester Center, Vermont. Thank you so much for your incredible support of indie bookstores and indie bookselling. And just a quick note, throughout the evening, you can use the chat to say hello, to let us know where you're signing on from. And you can use the Q&A box that you'll find at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions that you have. We'll have time for audience questions at the end of the event tonight. So you can pop your questions in there. We'll save them up and I'll pose them for you a little bit later on. I am so very excited to get to be here tonight celebrating the release today of Jennifer Dugan and Kit Seaton's excellent YA graphic novel, Coven. I've been a big fan of Jen's work since the release of her debut, Hot Dog Girl, and I've gotten to read all of her books. I'm incredibly lucky in that way, and she is so skilled at capturing the teenage voice and experience in her work. Kit Seaton, the incredibly talented artist who illustrated Coven, has also illustrated the graphic novel adaptations of Leigh Bardugo's Wonder Woman, Warbringer, and Alexandra Bracken's Brightly Woven, and she's the co-creator of the comics Norway and Afar. Please join me in welcoming them both to our screens this evening.
Hello.
Hi. All right, so it's you and me, Jen.
Yes. Okay, so we are going to do things a little differently today for people who have been to my virtual events at Northshire, because this is a little different book. It's special. It's a graphic novel. So this is my debut graphic novel. So while I am going to talk and we're going to ask questions and all that good stuff, Kit is also going to do a screen share with us and draw some of the characters while we're kind of chatting. So you'll have something to watch in addition to just listening. So I think it's going to be pretty fun. The first part, what I thought we would do is talk a little bit about how this is different, a graphic novel, and how the journey to get to this day has been a little bit different than with my other books. It's a lot more collaborative. It's been super fun to have you, Kit, and to work with you on this, but it all just starts with like a little boring script page. I think you can kind of see. So I thought it might be fun to actually read two of my script pages. And so you can kind of hear the kind of direction that we give to the artist, who then gets it and turns into, I'm actually going to be reading these two pages, which she has amazing galleys of, and she'll talk about how she took my like 5 words on this page and turned it into something gorgeous. So that will come next. So to set up the scene, Coven is about a witch named Emzy who lives out in California, and she's kind of having this perfect life where her powers have just been, she calls them parlor tricks. They're not a big part of her life. Her coven that she's from is back in upstate New York. And after there is a murder, her family pulls her from this kind of fun surfer girl life and drags her back out to the East Coast. And she has to learn to kind of embrace this new life, embrace her power, and find out who she truly is and who she wants to be. So on the pages that I'm going to read for you is the first time that she goes out into the woods. And Ash, who is another teen in her coven, is trying to convince her that she really needs to practice her magic, and she really needs to start respecting it and take her role in the coven seriously. So this is 76, and it says panel 1, full page. Emzy looking utterly shocked, Ash looking proud, surrounded by a large swampy pond covered in algae and lily pads. Frogs and snapping turtles and snakes live here. It's gross and beautiful all at once. And Ash says, ta-da, because he has just told her they don't have the ocean that she can surf on, but they have the second best thing. And it's, of course, this beautifully hideous pond. Panel 2, small inset on Emzy looking utterly disappointed. Emzy, oh God, I miss Callie. And then we go to the next page, page 77. Panel 1, Emzy nervous, Ash looking slightly annoyed, conjuring fire in one hand. Emzy, I don't know if this is a good idea. Panel 2, Ash determined, Emzy annoyed. Ash, you have to practice. If Liesl finds out you haven't been MZ, who's going to tell her? Panel 3, Ash's turn to look annoyed, MZ exasperated. Ash, you have to be able to protect yourself, especially with everything going on. Protect MZ, protect myself from what? Panel 4, MZ pointing to Ash's chest as she speaks. MZ, you basically said death witches don't exist anymore, and now suddenly it's life and death just because you want someone to play with? Right, I'm going home. Panel 5, MZ turning to leave but looking back at him. Ash grabs her arm, shouting. Ash, just because it wasn't a death witch doesn't mean it wasn't a witch at all. I just want you to be safe. So those are all of the directions that Kit got when it got sent to her. So for the splash page, I gave a lot of description on some of the things that I wanted to see in the swamp. But for the dialogue scenes, a lot of that is going to come from you, Kit. I don't need to like nitpick and tell you every little thing, because even though you're the one drawing the book and I wrote the script, we are co-authors, and the body language choices that she makes are just as important as what I put. So you might see as she walks you through these galleys that she made some different choices, slightly different choices, or moved the panel arrangement. So you can take that away.
Okay, sounds good. All right, so first things first, I think what I'll do here is I want to make sure I get this completely in the frame. So when the book is getting ready to be published, sometimes what they'll do is the publisher will send out galleys, which are basically all the pages on loose sheets of paper like this. And they include all of the color information, which will be sent to the printer. A lot of this is sort of within the CMYK. I'm not going to get into it, it's too technical. But you'll also see things like little crop marks and things like that that'll tell us where extra white space and things like that will be trimmed off. So that's why you don't see a big white margin around everything in the comic book, but a little bit of the art will get sliced off. So it's very important when I'm constructing these pages that I make sure I know where my full bleeds are going to be. So that bleed is where it gets trimmed off, and to not put anything too important in there. Otherwise it'll be bye-bye or chopped right down the middle. Very bad thing to have happen. So when I set my pages up from the very first thing, the first thing I'm thinking about is the margin and the bleed and how I can maximize that space and how I fill that space, which is really important. And splash pages are the most fun because it's basically one big giant illustration. I'm just going to slowly scroll up here. Hopefully it's not too wobbly. So you can see there's that big initial splash page that Jen read in the script there. There's the ta-da! Tiny little Ash there. And this is called a wide shot, or an establishing shot in parlance. And this usually, you'll see this used a lot in cinema. And the establishing shot helps you get a sense of the scene. It's basically a way to tell the audience, here we are. You know, here's all the elements that are going to be in the scene. And if I do my job correctly, they'll show up every time. And this helps give the audience a sense of place. They know where they are in the space, and it helps them feel a little bit more like they're in the world. Because basically the reader is almost like this tiny little camera, like a little drone or like a little robot, if that's a better way to think about it, that can fly around and zip around anywhere and basically find any perspective to which to view the story from. And that will really affect your perception of the story, what emotional response you'll get from the story, who's dominating the scene at the moment, whose emotions we should follow and keep track of. And there's a lot of rules that we use to help us construct these scenes and to keep things consistent. But the two most important rules that most illustrators try to follow is clarity, which is the most important thing. Is it clear? And the second thing, which, well, with all this detail, that might not be anyway, but the other second most important thing is it interesting? So clarity and interest. And if you can capture those two concepts, you'll usually be okay. So if you're getting into illustration, if you're thinking about being an illustrator or a comic artist one day yourself, you can think that those are the two major rules that you really need to consider. So the inset panel, that's another terminology that pops up in comics from time to time, but that right there is an inset. So what that means is that the panel is right within the border of the panel underneath it. And this is one of the very cool things about sequential art, is how you can have visual elements overlapping other visual elements. It's almost like another part of the scene crowds into the frame and starts talking over the top of it. So it's one of those things I think that can only really happen in comics, because I think if you tried to do that in cinema, it would be really confusing. But there's things that you can do with overlapping elements that play with space, and space in comics is also time. So yeah, actually the amount of space between gutters, like the gutters, the white spaces between panels, can tell you a lot about time as well, like the pacing of the story, how fast things are happening, or have things kind of slowed down and are going at more of a measured pace. And the best way to figure out what works best is just to experiment. And a lot of it depends on the visual language that the artist uses. So it kind of tends to be sort of how the artist interprets it. So when I get the script that talks about, you know, this kind of pretty but also icky kind of pond, like, you know, depends on how weird you are. Like I'm practically a goblin. Like this would be my jam. I would love to be here. I would probably get eaten alive by mosquitoes. I live in Georgia. It's a thing. Anyway, so you also have, but MC here is from California. It's not her jam. She does not love it. She wants to go back to the beach. So that kind of informs everything. And the color palette informs that too. You think of upstate New York in autumn, you think of all those beautiful, colorful changing leaves that make some of us go, ah, and she just does not love it. Like, get her the heck out of there, you know? But she also takes on some of the colors of the environment as well, because in a lot of ways, MZ has to adjust. She has to adapt to her new environment. And that means in some ways, letting that incorporate some ways with her design, or at least it's how I interpret it. So I will use colors, especially in their costumes, the clothes that they're wearing in the scenes, to show MZ's transition from being a California girl to an upstate New York girl. And you know, especially since it's cold, she has to wear all of her sweaters and her coats, which I'm sure she absolutely despises. So here on the second page, we have this interaction between Ash and MZ. And so one of the things I think about a lot is when you're staging characters in these complicated environments like forests, you're going to have a lot of business going on in the background, trees and moss and vegetation and all that texture that makes it a very interesting place to look at. But the problem is that if you're not careful, you can lose stuff in the noise. I live next to an Air Force or a naval base in Savannah. I don't know, one of those big helicopter things. I'm off on a tangent. Anyway, so big important thing is making sure characters are staged so that you can still read them and find them wherever they are. Just looking at the whole spread here, I bet you can pick out that color of MZ's coat, or the white kind of wool collar on Ash's bomber jacket there. And so I use color in this way to add like little pops of interest, just to kind of help you pick characters out of what's happening with all those textured inks and things like that. And if I'm successful, it helps with legibility and readability of the page so you don't get lost in all the information. So another thing that helps is that's why oftentimes speech balloons are black and white in color comics. You can do color balloons in color text, but that also makes it a little bit harder to read. And with all the business going on, you want things to be really legible. So other things, little things to note are some of the things I think about are like the color holds. So if you look at Ash's flame there, you can see that the line work there, instead of that being black, it's orange. So I'll use these a lot on elements in the pen's foreground, background, that kind of thing, as a way to push things back or bring things forward, depending on what it is. You see here in the flame, it helps that pop against all that black ink, against the bright, that kind of deep red of her coat. And so you get a little bit of contrast there. And if you look in the background here, you'll see all of this orange that represents more forestation kind of going in the back. Now, if this was all black, you know, that still would probably work, but you might lose some of Ash's hair there. So this also helps kind of create a sense of the horizon line. It creates depth of field. So I'll use color holds like that a lot, just to kind of create what we call sort of spatial separation. Right? Your foreground, your middle ground, your background. And as things go further back, we have an effect called atmospheric perspective, which is weaker or stronger depending on where you live in the country. Oddly enough, if you live in Denver, Colorado, the air is very thin up there. You don't have a lot of atmospheric perspective. But places like New York or even California, where you have a lot of sometimes smog in the air, you'll get a huge effect of atmospheric perspective. So things that go further back in space get lighter and they lose detail, and things that get further back in space, further towards you, the viewer, will get darker and more saturated, and you'll be able to pick out those details a little more clearly. So I use all those elements to stage scenes. Does that?
And I just write, there's fire in his palm.
And I'm like, oh, I'm going to put yeah. So the other thing that other thing when you're thinking about that too, fire in a palm, there's so many different ways that you can interpret that, right? And how you handle drawing the magic really depends on pretty much the image that pops into the artist's head. Now, not every artist does this. Like for me, I'll get a real clear image, it'll pop in my head, and there's like a race to get it down on paper before I lose it. Others will not be able to do that. There's actually artists that don't even have the ability to visualize in their head. So what do they do in those instances? You use a lot of visual reference. So you go to the source. What does fire look like? Okay. What does a hand on fire look like? Oh, that's not going to be a good thing to look up. I don't want to Google that. What do I do instead? Well, lots of movies have fire elemental stories in them, which is great because it's kind of like, oh, I'm part of this whole, lineage of witchcraft and wizardry stories, which is very exciting to be a part of. So you look at references and you look at, lots of different things. And what I would recommend is don't draw all from one source. Look at 5 or 10 different sources. And from that, you can construct something that kind of has your little bit of a twist or a spin on it. Like the way you draw a line or the way you interpret the shape is what's going to make that imagery unique. So, I'm always thinking about movement as well, lines of action, diagonals, horizontal and vertical lines and shapes. These are all ways that you can lead the viewer's eye to where you want them to look. But the other thing that's important there is that it keeps imagery dynamic and interesting to look at. And you can actually even say something psychologically with the shape. Like sometimes the vertical lines of the trees can look like bars on a prison, and Enzi feels like she's trapped. So that's a little bit of psychology there, maybe, I don't know. Maybe people pick that up or they don't. Maybe people will pick up things that you never even thought of. And that's kind of the fun of comics.
Well, speaking of the fun of comics, would you like to start drawing while we chat so they can see action?
So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here with you guys. Should be just a moment.
So Kit and I are going to talk more about our process and the book, but you get to watch her drawing while we do it.
Which is great because then I can sip my soda here. You guys can probably see me on the other screen. It's fine. Okay, I am ready.
Okay, there we go. All right. So I will start us off by asking you a question, which is just some basic background, kind of obligatory for people who don't know you. How did you get into illustration and comic work?
Okay, so it's kind of a long, funny story, but where it started was, oh gosh, why is this always such a, where should I start with that? A question, but I have loved art and comics and fantasy stories since I was a little kid. Like the first books that I picked up were fantasy stories. So comics were something that I did since I was 6 years old when I learned about Calvin and Hobbes. Yeah, it was Calvin and Hobbes. So I learned about Calvin and Hobbes, and then I started making my own knockoff comics, which you can imagine how well a 6-year-old can draw. And that's what I did. So that's kind of where it started. Was the interest was when I was very, very young. And so I had Calvin and Hobbes, and I had Peanuts, and I had Garfield, which is sort of a weird phenomenon on the internet now. Guess it kind of always has been. Anyway, so, but as I got older, in high school and stuff like that, I started feeling very insecure about my art. So oddly enough, I was doing theater instead. And I was helping my mom out with her theater program. She was a high school theater teacher in my hometown. So I would do costumes, I would do her posters. And when it came time for school, instead of thinking about, I should go ahead and study art or illustration, I thought the most sensible thing I could do, since I was terrible at art, actually, even though everybody was telling me different, was that I should go into costume design, which is very practical. So I studied costume design for a couple of years, and then figured out pretty quickly, well, this isn't it. So I had to reset. And it took about, I dropped out of school, I went home, and I was actually just like spinning my wheels at home for like 5 years in my little hometown in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. And I'm like, what am I doing? And finally, I think the story's a little bit longer and there's more twists and turns in that, but eventually I did decide to go ahead and do the thing that I wanted to do, which was get a degree in illustration and maybe study some comics. So I did that. I finally went to school. I went to school in Colorado, and I got my degree in illustration. And then after that, so I'm going to start drawing here since I'm just talking. I'm just going to start with some loose lines just to kind of warm up here a little bit. So after Colorado, I ended up sticking around and teaching, oddly enough. I started getting into the teaching thing. And I taught as an adjunct for a couple of years, decided to get my master's degree in illustration as well. And then I started teaching full-time courses in illustration and comics all over the country, different schools. And then I decided, well, why not try doing some web comics, actually making some comics. So I started with web comics, right? Did some with my sister, did some goofy things on the internet. And eventually a friend from school got in contact with me and said, hey, how would you feel about working on a graphic novel together? And I thought, well, gosh, that would be really fun, because this friend of mine was already a great artist and was working in the industry already. Layla Del Duca, who at the time was working on a comic with Image. And she's like, I want to write a story and have you illustrate it. And that was very surprising that this great artist would want me to draw her book, but we did, and that was afar. And that was a great project to work on. And that was my first graphic novel. And then the project that webcomic I was talking about was a project I was doing with my sister. We got that one published through Image. And then after that, suddenly more of these jobs started coming through. So it was really cool. I'm going to start working on drawing a cat here. So
yeah, Kitty was a special request for me. There's a very grumpy cat in this book named Kitty, and she is definitely one of my favorite characters. And so when we were discussing what she would draw, I was like, please draw Kitty.
Well, speaking of Kitty, I've got Purdy right here. I wish you guys could see her. Maybe I could turn the camera around. Purdy, can you see her?
We can see the whiskers. Yes. Hello, Kitty.
This is the cat that I found in my backyard. So she's always here. I'll just leave the camera on her so I don't have to be in the frame all the time. They're pretty. Say hi. Good girl. Here, we'll focus on this nice hat here. There's some flowers on it. There we go. Okay, so now back to drawing. I'm going to draw a cat for real now. And in the meantime, since you've asked me that question, how about I ask you a question? How would that work?
Okay.
All right, so my question for you is, how were you inspired to write Coven? You've got a whole story there, and I think everybody should hear it.
Yeah, so I was actually inspired by a frog, a real frog that I met. I like to go trail running in the woods, and there's a pond near my house, which I based the pond that we showed you in the layouts on. And it's like frog heaven, basically. It's full of all these like bullfrogs and these green, like, I don't know what kind of frogs they are, but every time I would go running, I would stop at the pond and there would just be this one frog sitting on a specific branch. He must have just lived there, and we would just stare at each other. And one day I just started to imagine like it definitely felt like he was annoyed I was there. And so I just started thinking about like, why would he hate someone, and what could have happened to this frog to make him so distrustful, despite the fact that it's probably just that he's like, can you please keep running, I'm trying to catch bugs. And so from there came an entire scene that Coven spun out of, where there's two witches practicing their magic, and it kind of goes astray, and the frog, who does end up okay, spoiler alert, but he does get caught in the crossfire. And so once I had that idea in my head, I couldn't stop thinking about it. And it ended up me just trying to think about who would be practicing magic in the forest, and why would they be there, and why would they be doing that? And then before I knew it, I had the entire plot of Coven, and the original scene of the frog as it existed that day when I was sitting by my own pond actually made it into the final draft of Coven. So it started with the frog, and now it ends with the frog. You can all have that story in your house.
That's great.
Yeah, that's what
Everybody has that little frog story in their house. I like that.
And one interesting, that does kind of lead into one thing I forgot to mention, is that we always talk about how the publishing timeline is so weird, right? Like it takes you like 18 to 24 months to put out a book. The timeline for graphic novels is even more chaotic. If you thought the timeline for a regular novel was a lot, because after we go through all the same steps, Kit still has to draw the whole book. So just to put it in perspective, I checked all of my books have like a little baby book. So Coven was actually born in this Captain America journal. It has all my notes and everything, and I keep all of the dates. And so I actually started drafting Coven in July of 2018. And Kit got involved in March of 2020. And now it came out today.
Yeah.
So that should put it into perspective for you, the kind of process and what we're dealing with. It takes a while to draw the perfect kitty.
It does. It takes lots of practice. Cats are hard, actually. I love them. And maybe there's this sense when you love something so much, then there's so much more pressure to get it right. And I really feel that with cats. I don't know how. I'm just like, no, it's
made you draw one today.
Well, it's like you're like, oh, draw Kitty. Well, I love Kitty, but oh man, it's such a challenge. But you know what? It's good for me. It's good. I need the practice.
Our next book will just fill it with cats.
Oh no.
Just be all cat. The main characters will be cats. Just really level you up there in your cat skills.
That's what I need. Hey, the Catskills, which is also in New York. All right. Anyway.
So I guess my next question for you would be what attracted you to the Coven script? What made you want to sign on? I know when they were sending me portfolios as a potential artist to work with, I just loved your work.
Oh, really?
And I was really excited because that was the style I was really looking for, kind of like realistic, but with a little flair. And
like that.
Yeah, it was great. I wanted them to be like very shippable people. So I didn't want it to be too like stylized. And then when I started getting your character designs, I was just completely blown away. Was there anything in particular about the Coven pitch that really made you be like, this is something I'd want to do? Or were you just like, I really like witches?
Oh, well, of course, you're probably going to get me on the hook anyway. If you should say queer witches, stuff, frogs, there's a cat in it. Does that make me sound
No,
vapid.
those are actually my favorite things about it. So
No, there was a lot that I really enjoyed about it. I liked MZ as a character, and it's funny. Like as I was reading it, a picture of her kind of popped into my head, and pretty much what you saw in the character design sketch was how I saw her. This is looking like my cat Scout. I didn't mean for that. He's in the room. I'm trying to make this look a little bit more like Kitty, but. Yeah, she popped in my head right away. And there were several characters in there where I was just like, wow. And the butterfly woman who was just like, oh my gosh, I see so many ways that I could, like the design for her popped into my head. So, I mean, once I start getting visual imagery, and of course there's that novelty and that excitement of, new characters popping into your head. And like, of course, if they'll give me the book, then yeah, I want to do it. So I'm glad it worked out. I really am. So yeah, I mean, yeah, I think that was it, the characters. So, and the settings. I had been to all those places. Well, I've been to New York City. I haven't been to upstate New York, but I've been in the surrounding areas. I've been in Connecticut. I've been in Massachusetts. So I love that part of the East Coast, and also having spent time in Southern California. Those two territories are so distinctive. The contrast of that, I think, was exciting and interesting too. So there was a lot there to work with. So yeah, I mean, I was really excited that it even come my way in the first place. I'm like, how did they find me? So that was nice.
amazing art directors on the hunt.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, they're out there. You never know. And the art director on this project was amazing, by the way. Okay, so since we're on the topic of character design and how I got excited about character development, how do you go into developing a character like MZ? What's your process for that? I want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I listen to a lot of music, actually. When I first meet a new character, I will start thinking one of the easiest ways for me to start getting in their head is to start thinking about what kind of songs they would listen to and make a playlist from that. And it's not necessarily what I like to listen to while I work. It's just kind of a way to kind of like a shortcut to get into their character. And then from there, I can kind of build them out and start thinking about, how they would react to things. And I think once you kind of know people's playlist, you kind of can figure out their vibe. And it just kind of all falls into place for me there. And that's really, it's like, I think Stephen King was like, you should know them down to like their pocket lint or something like that. And people do these really developed like character sheets. But for me, I need to understand the emotions before I can really care about the nitty gritty. I need to know like what they're feeling and how they're thinking and just kind of their interpretation of the world before I can interpret them on the page. So that's kind of how it goes. I kind of just am refilling the well with a bunch of media. And then all of a sudden I would be like, this would be their favorite movie. This would be their favorite song. And then it's like, they just exist.
I love that. And I like that it's kind of based off of feeling, because I feel like that is sort of how it is for me. Sometimes I think it's just because like I'm geared to things being just anything that's really interesting, but a lot of it is based on feeling. So the way that you say that is yeah, and that's really kind of how I hold interest on when I'm doing all of this work, because it is, as you say, pages and pages of drawings of characters and movements and faces. That what really ties me or keeps me invested is how is this character feeling, and because then if I know how they're feeling, then it's sort of like I'm kind of like, I don't know, I sort of feel like I'm one of those control freak directors like Charlie Chaplin or something like that, where I'm like, do it again, but do it exactly like this. Like, it's better that I have comic characters to do this too, because then they can do exactly the way I want them to do it. But
threaten to erase them.
Yeah, exactly. Do as I, oh man, I should start doing that. See if they would cooperate more, just threaten them, work you, or you will be gone into the void. But yeah, the emotions, how the character feels, how deeply they're feeling, like, is it a really like intense emotion, or is it just kind of more of a surface level blip? And how do you interpret that? And I really love how much that can shift in the subtlety of an expression, but it's also so aggravating because that's, I can spend hours like fiddling. Well, maybe not hours, that sounds hyperbolic, but a lot of time just fiddling with the corner of the mouth because it's so important, that flick and what that says. So yeah, I'll spend a lot of time just worrying about those little details. So that resonates with me. I hear you there.
So this is kind of unrelated to what we've been talking about, but I do want to make sure that we leave time at the end for Q&A. Okay. So one of the questions that I'm dying to know, did you sneak any Easter eggs or anything silly in any of the work that you did that I haven't noticed yet?
Oh gosh.
Or were you completely good? You could be completely good.
I have to remember. See, this is the problem with me, because at the moment I might have been like in the layouts and then completely forgot that I did it. And that's one of the fun things about being ADHD. But yes, there probably are. Okay, there is one. So MZ's girlfriend. First time you see her, she's in like her little panel. She's chilling out in like her mom and dad's living room or whatever. She's in this really cool, like, modular chair in like what you would maybe find in coastal LA. And she has a little puppy, right? And because I thought, let's give a kid a puppy and an espresso. And so she's just chilling there talking with her girlfriend on the phone. And I'm like, what a great way to maybe give us some insight into the character, to just like throw a puppy into the scene and be like, she has a really cute puppy. And the puppy is a little bit based on my dog when she was a puppy. And Kitty might be a little bit influenced by the cats in my life, but they would be an amalgam, which, as I know, Kitty, also for you, reminds you of all the kitties that you have had. And so basically Kitty is an avatar for all the cats we have had in our life that we love.
Kitty is very expressive, so a wonderful avatar.
Yeah, I like her. Sassy little thing.
I actually also, I snuck one Easter egg in. I snuck a reference to this really bad witchy movie called The Covenant. It's like awful, and nobody has caught it. And the whole time, and so one of my artist friends, I was like, there's no way this is going to make it all the way through this one line. And it did. And I remember eagerly texting after we made it to copy edits. And I was like, I think it's going to make it. I'm not going to say what page it's on, because I feel like if anyone figures it out, Ian emails me, I will like give them a bunch of prizes, like a whole box of signed books or something.
Okay.
So that's
seriously, I feel like I want to know, because I might have seen The Covenant, but I don't know if I remember The Covenant. And I'm thinking like, okay, if that's in there, how did I draw that?
We'll have to do a group watch and see if you can figure out where my reference was to that movie. Okay. Everyone in the group chat, we can all just, everybody that's here today on the Zoom, we can all just watch it together.
Watch a terrible witch movie.
Yeah.
Can we watch my terrible witch movie then? Make everybody suffer.
Yeah, I don't know if people are here that are on our team at Putnam, but surprise. We snuck in a couple of things.
Actually, when I illustrated the book, I was completely inspired by The Love Witch. The whole time I was, actually, that is a really good film. It's a weird film, but I digress. But it's in there, guys. Look for it. You'll have to watch The Covenant now just to find Jen's reference.
So I think we could probably, if we're efficient, ask each other one more question. So do you have a favorite question?
Then I want to ask you
some audience Q&A.
So what I would like to know is what favorite imagery from witchcraft lore, witch history, that kind of thing, what kind of things inspired you about all of that knowledge, and how did that filter into the book?
I think I actually took more of a modern, like I have definitely, in terms of like historical witch lore, I've been to like Salem, for instance, like a million times, and things like that, kind of get like baked into your DNA when you're someone who likes spooky stuff.
Yeah.
So I've absorbed a lot of it, and I was like one of the like spooky kids in high school. So I
Ah,
definitely read a lot of I studied a lot of books about Wicca and different things like that, and different kind of
mhm.
more natural religions, which is where we get some of the like element like based magic system, is kind of based on some of those elements. But mostly I just absorb it through a lot of media. I love modern witch media,
Hmm.
like The Craft. I guess that's not modern anymore. Um, the
But I love
original
that
Craft,
movie. Yeah, such a it's
just
time
Austen
capsule.
queen
Yeah.
witches, and I thought they all should have just dated each other, and
Right.
we wouldn't have any of the problems we would have had.
That
And
was
so
probably
things
the
like that.
motif the entire time of that film, actually, now that you mention it.
Yeah, and so it's just things like that where I'm like, I just like to take existing things and kind of play a little bit more with like gender and who they like to date, and who they're in love with, and what your typical love interest is, um, and things like that. So I just try to kind of make them a little more into what I would want to see.
I love that. It's so funny that you say you got into witchcraft and all that stuff in high school, because when I was in high school, I wrote a whole like see, I think it was my junior paper or something like that on the Malleus Maleficarum. So like I was also, yeah, the dark spooky teen who was weirdly into history. But I got really
We were
into it.
destined to meet like this as adults.
Well, the Malleus Maleficarum was like that. It had more to do with witch hunters and oh gosh, I can never remember that guy's name. It was Matthew something or other, but he was the one who was wandering around in the 16th century and basically, getting all these people in these villages to knock off all their neighbors and say that's a witch and that's a witch and that's a witch. And he basically became this kind of pop culture icon for a time, but he was basically spreading nonsense. And yeah, just it's such weird history, but
Yeah,
yeah, but fascinating. So
yeah.
I don't recommend reading the Malleus Maleficarum. I did. It's you can pick up the names of really fun familiars. Like that's where names like Ilamalzar and Pyewacket and Sack and Sugars. You can find all kinds of great names to name your pets out of that book. You can also learn weird things about bits and body parts getting turned into squirrels and sent up trees. But after a while, you just realize you're reading madness. So
Yeah.
yeah, but the history of the witch trials is very fascinating. The Malleus Maleficarum is somebody's fever dream. But anyway, I agree.
Well, on that very interesting note, should we go to audience questions?
Sure, we've got some great ones coming in. And audience, if you have other questions, you can feel free to put them into the Q&A box that you'll find at the bottom of your screen or in the chat. And the first one I have here came from Ashley for Jen, saying, how old were you when you started getting into writing?
I was like 5. I used to give everybody for Christmas, I used to make, even before I could actually write, I would go and like cut out, and it's interesting because I guess they technically were graphic novels, but I would cut out like pictures from the Sunday comics and then write my own like word bubbles. And that's what everybody got for Christmas, was I would painstakingly like recreate, like take Garfield, but he would go on some kind of adventure with, whoever else was like Calvin and Hobbes, like you said. Um,
Mhm.
And so that's when so pretty much my whole life I've wanted to be a writer. But I would say that I didn't seriously start writing with an eye towards publishing books until I was probably 30. Um, I did a lot of other things with my life, and I needed to kind of experience all of that, I think, to be ready to tell the stories that I am. I had a lot of growing to do and things like that. So I'm always blown away by people who are writing very seriously and they're like teenagers or they're in their 20s, their early 20s. I was way too big of a mess, like way too big of a mess. You would not have wanted to read those books. Um, my first novel, the entire thing just took place in an apartment and they never left. So I definitely needed time to develop and figure out my voice and the stories that I wanted to tell.
Hey, you know, there's nothing wrong with being a late bloomer.
Yes.
This next question came to me in direct messages and is also for Jen. It says, your previous novels were all realistic fiction. For this first foray into fantasy, did you have to adjust your process at all to accommodate the world building?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely had to do, I want to say like the first draft of the Coven script, the notes that I got back on it were, how does any of this work? And I'm like, I don't know. I don't know. They could just shoot fire out of their hands. Why do we need to know how? It's just important that it can. So yeah, it was definitely hard. It was definitely hard to incorporate, just to really work in the fantasy elements. But even contemporary requires some world building effort. Whether I'm setting it in an amusement park and I want to make you feel like you're there, or you're in an upstate Coven. But it definitely was different. I could never do like a high fantasy. That would just not interest me, where I had to do everything. So my work will continue to be grounded in the realistic, kind of contemporary world. But now it's just like a Jen Dugan book plus magic. So you get a little bonus in there.
Yeah. Excellent. This next question is from Ashley again, and it's for both of you. Do you have anything that you think about or listen to, music or whatever it may be, to get you motivated to create when you're not necessarily wanting to work at any given moment? She's asking as someone who has a lot of writer's block.
Do you want to answer first?
You want me to go first?
Sure.
Oh, God. Okay, so being someone who's always looking for novelty and interest, I think I'm one of those that has to have a lot of buzz and stimulation. And so I'll consume just like a ton of media that's going while I'm drawing. I might be listening to a podcast, or somebody puts together a video essay. And there are times when I'm like, I'm really into a certain musician and I have to listen to their stuff just on repeat over and over and over again. And then there's times where I'm like, the only thing I want to listen to is like rain, static, a crackling fireplace, so I'm just like all over the place. But right now I'm really into the artist Cosmo Sheldrake. And he's a UK artist. I don't know if anybody's familiar with his stuff, but he does a lot of, what I love about his work is that he incorporates a lot of sounds from nature, even like a cat purring or a blue-footed booby call or something like that. And it's very textured and overlapping. And a lot of the times he'll draw inspiration from bits and fragments of folklore, or nonsense poems. Like there's a nonsense poem by Edward Lear called Pelican's Wee, and he wrote a whole song to that poem. And I just love the energy in it, and so it just makes my brain feel like pop rocks. So I've been listening to a lot of that lately. I don't know if that necessarily helps me when I'm dealing with artist block. My cures for that are a little bit more practical, but you can find inspiration in all kinds of things, and definitely music is one of those. So you take it away, Jen. Take it from me, please, before I stop. Don't make me.
Well, I'm just thinking that my brain feeling like pop rocks is probably the opposite of the headspace that I want to be in while I'm writing. So that's really funny. I do. I listen to a lot of music. Every book will have a playlist. I'm hoping to get the Coven playlist up later this week, and I'll put it up on Spotify for everyone. Everyone seemed to have a lot of fun when we did that for Melt With You and Some Girls Do. So you can kind of see what I was listening to while I was drafting it back in, but be gentle because it was happening in 2017, 2018. So don't expect like current hits. But yeah, I mean, for me, I think it's important. I don't really accept writer's block. I just am like, no.
Mhm.
And I just sit down and work. For me personally, if I give myself an excuse, for me,
Mm.
if I give myself an excuse, I will give myself an excuse every day, and it becomes really impossible for me to get back to work. So if I am having like an actual, like it's a bad mental health day or there's something going on in real life, I will give myself a lot of grace. But if it's a day-to-day work and I'm like, I don't feel like doing it, I just say buck up, buttercup, and sit down, and I will sit at my desk. And maybe it's not always the most productive, but I need to keep that routine, because for me, mentally, I need to keep my routine of I sit down, I work during these hours, and then I take a break. Otherwise, what happens is I lose all control of work-life balance, because when I feel like working, I will want to work for like 18 hours straight. So I can't trust my like internal rhythm with that, because it's going to be like you're going to stay up for 3 days and work, and then sleep for a week. So I really just have to say, like, forget it. No, you're going to work now. We're going to do this, and do that. But I can't listen to anything other than music while I'm drafting. And then when I'm revising, I need dead silence, because
Yeah.
I need to act out pretty much every scene. So
Yeah.
I can't have anything distracting me. So yeah, I don't know if that's really helpful. I think you have to just figure out as a writer what works best for you. And it's just going to be really trial and error.
I usually tell myself, because sometimes it's like that for me with drawing too, that I'm just not feeling it. But I think what I just say is like, you know what, even if I go there and the well is dry, I have to show up and I have to do something. And once I push through that initial, and it's not to say that it's not suffering, because it definitely is, but once you kind of get past that initial painful thing, you'll usually find something that can keep you going. And even at the end of the day, if you come back to it and you end up throwing all of it out, usually the reason why you've done that is because something finally came to the fore that helps you solve the visual problem or the dialogue problem or whatever, a little bit better. And you probably might not even have gotten there if you hadn't even gone through that slog of a process. So you have to show up even when inspiration doesn't. And if I'm having a really tough time, then I at least try to say, okay, just, do what you can, do it for 5 minutes. If you're really, really suffering, then take a break, try again. And if it's still bad, then, well, okay, maybe tomorrow. But, I rarely have days that are that bad, but I have had them. And they do suck.
Yes.
But usually the next day is always going to be different. So you try again.
That's great advice from both of you. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
We are just about out of time, but I wonder if we could wrap up. I know it seems silly on a day when there's a brand new book out, but if there are any upcoming projects that either of you can tease us a little bit about that you're allowed to tell us about.
I don't know what we are allowed to say and what we are not allowed to say. I will say in the very near future, you will be hearing more from us.
Yes.
So there are things in the pipeline. So we're very excited, but it's not quite announced yet. In terms of graphic novel with Kit, we will be working. This is not the last you've seen of this team up. So we'll have that to share. And I also do have a novel coming out next year, and it is not at all what you think. And you should be hearing more about that soon also.
Yeah, same thing. So what I like to say is that whatever happens in the coven stays in the coven, and Jen likes to add the caveat, but for now.
Yeah.
But what I've got going on, it's a mystery. We'll see. I would say the best way to find out is you can find me on Instagram as Kit Illustrate, and new information will also be on my website, kitseaton.com. And I might post whatever I'm doing there. I might. It could happen. So that's all I got.
Fantastic. Well, thank you both so much for celebrating with us tonight. It was a real treat to get to be here with you, to get to see you draw, Kit. This is amazing for you to do, especially while we were just like hanging out here and chatting. So
beautiful girl.
Yes, there she is. So thank you both so much. Thank you, audience, for being here. You can, if you haven't done so already, you can order a copy of Coven at northshire.com and check out other great upcoming events there.
Thank you so much for having us. This was so fun.
Yes, I had a great time.
Thank you both, and everyone have a great night.
Bye.